Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar about the new EU VAT rules that were brought in last year, including the introduction of OSS and IOSS. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Institute of Export and International Trade. My name is William Barnes-Graham, the Senior Content Editor at the Institute, and I will be your host for this morning. Next slide, please. Here you will see it is my delight to welcome our speaker today in Paul Woodward. Hey Paul, how are you today?
I'm fine, Will. Good morning everybody as well, and welcome to this webinar on the IOSS and OSS. There's loads of changes which came in mid last year, so it's really important that we understand that and help anybody on the webinar today to understand what the requirements are.
Great stuff, thanks Paul. And as you can see, Paul is a customs and trade consultant at the Institute with over 25 years experience working in international trade and customs. He's also become a regular on our recent webinars, so you're definitely in safe hands today. On the next slide though, before we get into the presentations, we're going to run a quick poll to find out a little bit more about you, our audience, and how you've been impacted by the new EU VAT rules that were introduced last year. So you can here say that you've either been significantly impacted, minimally impacted, not impacted, and there's an option to say you're not sure as well. While you are answering that poll, just a couple of housekeeping notes from me. Firstly, you can contact me with any comments or questions using the question panel on the control window to the right-hand side of your screen. We hope to get to a number of your questions throughout the webinar and during the Q&A towards the end, though please note we cannot guarantee that we will get to every single question in the allocated time. Today's webinar is 45 minutes. So just a quick tip as well, if your questions are concise and easy for me to read, I am more likely to read them. Finally, you will receive access to today's slide pack, as well as a recording of the webinar in a follow-up email we will be sending over the next day or so. If you don't get this email, please feel free to email us and we'll send it to you directly as well. But I'll give you a couple more seconds to answer the poll. Thank you everyone for answering so far. I'm going to close it now. So here are our responses. Interestingly, it's quite a split. So about a quarter of you have been significantly impacted, 23%, slightly more have been impacted, but less so, minimally. 15% of you have not been impacted, and about a third of you are not sure. Paul, any surprises about what you'd expect?
Well, it is kind of a mixed bag that we're seeing there. With some of the changes which have come in, some traders have turned off e-commerce for Europe because obviously of the challenges that they're facing. So the 15% could come into that bracket. They may not have been done if they're over certain thresholds that we will speak about today. But yeah, I'm seeing pretty much there across the board, 50% are people which are impacted, whether it's significantly or minimally, but also we've got over a third which are potentially not sure. So hopefully the information in today's webinar will help them engage with what the rules are, how they affect them, and how they need to move forward.
Absolutely, thanks Paul, and thanks everyone for answering. As Paul says, we'll hopefully address some of your queries and concerns today. But on the next slide, it's enough of me and it's over to you, Paul. So over to you.
Brilliant, thank you, Will, and again, welcome everybody. So today we've got agenda which is set forth on the screen for you. We're going to be first looking at those regulatory changes, what's happened, how's it impact you, why they've been brought into place. We're then going to be looking at what the import one-stop shop is and the one-stop shop. Then we'll be diving into how you register for these schemes, what you need to be aware of. Then how do you use the portals, because these are VAT simplifications which have been brought in place, and then what you'll need to do for maintaining compliance. So yeah, nice structure through today, giving you all the information that you need in regard to e-commerce activities. Next slide, please. So let's first look at these regulatory changes. And these were brought in and came into force in the 1st of July last year. And these really pertain to new e-commerce rules, which create significant changes for UK retailers, marketplaces, postal and courier companies when you're selling to EU consumers. And so I suppose it's really crucial that businesses, traders take time to understand the impact that these new rules may have on them. Next, please. So the first element that we'll look at from the regulatory changes is the revised Payment Services Directive. This was brought in to regulate payment services and payment service providers throughout the EU, but it also includes a European Economic Area as well. This is really there to harmonise consumers being aware of all the costs in advance and their refund rights. In regard to parcel deliveries, we now have the removal of the low value consignment relief. Previously, this was €22. That has been completely removed now and abolished, meaning that import VAT and duty will need to be paid upon import. But with the import one-stop shop being implemented, this is one of the simplification measures that was introduced. This obviously has knock-on effects, as we've had the abolition of the VAT de minimis rule, with the OSS requiring 3 less data sets and standard customs declarations. So abolishing of certain requirements, but simplifying your VAT process in others. Geo blocking, when we look at this basically prohibits discriminating between European Economic Area customers based on their location. So this could be such as blocking access to a website, automatically redirecting customers away from a website, or charging different prices. And this is an important aspect which came into play. It applies when customers are buying goods online. There is exclusions for copyrighted materials such as ebooks, for instance. Electronically supplied services, this could be web hosting, cloud storage, or services provided in a physical location. So this could be aspects like tickets to a theme park or tickets to a sporting event, for instance. The UK in itself had revoked this regulation, so this leaves UK traders free to decide whether to offer such goods and services to consumers which are in the European Economic Area. An important factor, though, that we do need to bear into mind, though, is if a trader decides to offer these services to one country, a consumer in one country, it cannot discriminate between any other countries within the European Economic Area. So again, offering it to one means you offer it to all, so do be aware of that. If this is the case, then business customer has the same rights as consumers in terms of non-discrimination. So again, it's bearing in mind where you sit with that and how you operate from a business perspective. So it's important to be aware of those elements. So can we have the next slide, please? Okay, the next element we're looking at is regulation. So we've got the Digital Services Act, also known as the DSA, which came into force. This is legislation from the EU to modernise the e-commerce directive and really refers to digital services that include large categories of online services, from simple websites, internet infrastructure services, and potentially online platforms. It includes measures aimed at better protecting internet users and their fundamental rights online to create an even playing field within this online space. This will require transparency reporting by actors involved, which focuses primarily on the largest technological players which are out there. So you'll be looking at the Amazons, aspects like that. But the main goals here are to protect the consumer, establish transparency, and to generate innovation, growth, and competitiveness within the European single market. Next slide, please. Following on from that, we do have the e-commerce directive, and this is really the legal foundation framework for online services in the EU. So this provides aspects and controls in regard to making sales in European Economic Area countries. So again, utilising in there, but understanding where the country the consumer is established. So really looking at the country of origin principle again. Remember, post-Brexit, this no longer applies to UK providers, but now you must comply with national regulations in each of the EEA countries where you make sales, including any national rules on online information, advertising, shopping, contracting, and in some cases you might need prior authorization and licensing. The Information Society Services, which relates to the e-commerce directive, is defined very broadly and includes most economic activities that take place online. So selling goods, services, advertising, transmission of information via a communication network. That does not though include TV or radio broadcasting, hosting information, and providing commercial communications by email. So there is a wide range which are covered within this. The directive itself exempts intermediaries from liability for the content they manage if they fulfill certain conditions. So again, exemptions are in place that should be aware of. Service providers hosting illegal content will need to remove it or disable the access as soon as possible to obviously ensure that that isn't provided to any people visiting their hosted facilities. The liability exemption only covers services who play a natural, merely technical and passive role towards hosting that content. So again, e-commerce directive, they're setting out your basic mandatory consumer information. It's a key principle of their internal market clause and that exemption which we've mentioned for intermediaries there. Next slide, please. So let's look at the key changes here. So we've had the extension of the MOSS, the mini one-stop shop. This is now being renamed as the one-stop shop. So MOSS has just changed into Oss. Bit of a mouthful, but that's basically what's happened. We've had the introduction of the import one-stop shop, IOSS. This is introduced for low-value consignments with the threshold that we'll be speaking about later. This really proceeds with the removal of VAT registrations in every EU member state, creating VAT simplification. So they are tools and portals you can use to do your payment of import VAT that you've made for e-commerce sales in one portal, so you don't have to register in every EU member state. Again, LVCR, the low value consignment relief, has now been abolished, so anything with any value will have import VAT applied to it. Also important to note the distance selling thresholds, especially if you're selling within Europe. Each member state had its own. They have been eliminated now, and there's a standard ceiling of 10,000 euros. Remember, distance selling thresholds do not apply to GB businesses anymore. We're not saying UK because of Northern Ireland and being part of the single market there. Intermediaries or fiscal representation may be needed. In the cases of any of these portals, you would be looking at having to have them, but it's also important to understand that if you're setting up a VAT registration in an EU member state, it's best to check the requirements at a national level because some require representation, some don't. So again, it's a country by country analysis. And deemed seller responsibilities are coming to play. Deemed seller, if you are offering goods or services, but you are selling those through a marketplace such as Amazon, Etsy, two examples there, then if it's below, especially for goods underneath the threshold for the IOSS, then those responsibilities under the 13th VAT directive move over to the marketplace themselves. So they will be responsible for accounting for that VAT. So it's really important to understand if I'm selling goods or services through e-commerce channels, am I doing it through my own website where I have that responsibility, or is it through a marketplace and they potentially have that deemed seller responsibilities as well? Next slide, please. Okay, so we've mentioned it there. So let's now have a look at fiscal representation. So this is it's very common all over the world to have fiscal representations, including Europe, where most of EU member states require a fiscal representation for various legal activities you would do. For companies providing goods or services in foreign countries, there may be a requirement to VAT register as a non-resident VAT trader. With this, under certain circumstances, that tax authority locally may also require a company to appoint a fiscal representative to represent them in that market. This is basically a tax registered company that will be the local representative of the company, managing queries and filing obligations of the company for dealings with the tax authorities. They may also be liable for the VAT liability of that company as well. So non-EU resident businesses must have in place an EU resident representative for the purpose of customs clearance and import VAT. This is a clear requirement out of the EU's Union Customs Code, also known as the UCC, where the importer cannot present an EORI number associated with EU residency. So the benefits here, which we'll be looking at for a representative, is it allows foreign traders to use representatives in-country business address from which they can apply from their VAT registration, enables foreign exporters to act as importer of record and effectively import their goods at a price that is different from the ultimate selling price to the consumer. So again, this can calculate lower values, and it provides foreign traders with an all-round VAT compliance services. So here they can be doing statistical reports, they can be doing your VAT filings for you, they will be the contact point if the local tax authority reaches out with a query. So again, they will have that expertise in country, and let's not forget the language barrier as well. You know, so if we were registered in Germany, having a representative with an office in Germany, speaks the local language, understands the VAT requirements, they can deal with those matters for you. Typically though, they will charge higher fees and often require a bank guarantee or a cash deposit to protect them from any client losses that could occur. So a real important role that fiscal representation actually does play, and especially now that we've left the EU. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to look, we've just had to look at the regulatory changes. So now we're going to focus on what the import one-stop shop is and the one-stop shop. So can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so to help facilitate compliance and reduce the burden of managing EU VAT accounting obligations, the new one-stop shop schemes have been introduced by the EU as part of the recent reforms. Though these schemes are eligible businesses will be able to register with just one EU tax authority to manage their VAT obligations across the whole of the EU, which has the potential to achieve significant administrative and cost savings. So within this, there are 3 types under the one-stop shop. You will have the import one-stop shop, IOSS, the one-stop shop, OSS, and the non-union one-stop shop. So looking at these in order here. So when we look at the import one-stop shop, this was brought in for low value goods which are entering the EU to end consumers. But your consignment value cannot exceed 150 euros. If they don't, then you can register for this import scheme. You will need a representative in place. If the supplier yourselves have no establishment EU, that intermediary will be needed to be used. This new IOSS will require a supplier to charge and collect EU VAT at the point of sale, so your online checkout, with VAT will be settled in a monthly return through the import one-stop shop. This will then allow the goods to be VAT exempt at the point of import, with the objective of faster customs clearance being available. So it must be noted that when we're looking at this, the OSS or the IOSS are not mandatory. They are an alternative to businesses that can register and use for them without having options in every country. So again, very important there to be aware of. Next slide, please. Okay, so when looking at this, import one-stop shop, very clearly, it is for goods originating from outside the EU. They must be imported prior to delivery to EU consumers, especially that DDP role that we're so used to before Brexit. The consignment value cannot exceed 150 euros, and one EU registration will cover all EU member states, and it will be a monthly return that you would do through the IOSS platform. Next slide, please. How the IOSS works? Well, yeah, we've got, so when a consumer is visiting your website for goods, the VAT would be calculated at checkout. So really important for traders there. VAT rates, import VAT rates are different in every EU member state. So based on the delivery address, that's based on the country you will be shipping to. Therefore, what is that VAT rate that needs to be applied? Also really important is checking your VAT groups as well. So again, understanding, do your goods come under VAT exemption within that EU country? Is it standard rate or is it reduced VAT rate? Making sure that you're charging the right amount of VAT at checkout. Those VAT rates will then be applied, and you should inform consumers that you are IOSS compliant, a bit like any kite mark standard that you would have. It should be very present on your website as well. Then once obviously that's been collected, they've paid for the goods, including VAT, is then shipped. Then after your sales have been processed, you would validate your monthly sales, identify VAT that needs to be paid. Go to the next one, please. Thank you. You can use an intermediary service to validate your figures, and they can also act as that local tax authority. So again, it is really important to understand the roles an intermediary can take. You will need a representative for this, but also there's valid actions they can take to ensure that you are VAT compliant when submitting returns. Next. You would access the IOSS portal and submit your monthly return. And obviously these intermediaries or the representatives can be looked at, so they can do those on your behalf. Next. So when we look at the one-stop shop, this does come under the free schemes that we've got. So the one-stop shop, also known as the union scheme, this is there for intra-EU supplies, and it will be covering all types of B2C services and goods. Yeah, so again, it's very important that you understand the OSS is if your goods or services are actually in Europe already, then this aids with the domestic supply and dealing with your VAT requirements there. This has been expanded to cover intra-EU distance sales of goods and certain domestic supplies to consumers, which are done by electronic interfaces such as marketplace platforms, where the interface will become the deemed seller for that purpose, so the Etsy, the Amazon. The extension of this scheme is to include sales of goods to consumers, also coincides with removal of current distance selling thresholds. You know, I've mentioned it's just 10,000 euros across the board now. So again, really important OSS there for goods which are imported into bulk into EU warehouses or fulfillment centres. One EU registration does cover all EU member states. And if you're wondering what happened to Moss, it has now been replaced by the one-stop shop. With this, you will do quarterly VAT returns as well. So really key if you are supplying a marketplace like an Amazon out there, they'll be asking you to fulfill their warehouse with your stock in Europe and deliver it on DDP basis. Yeah, the case in question is then it would be from an Amazon perspective in Europe to be supplied in Europe. Therefore, it would come under the one-stop shop rule. Okay, next slide, please. Non-union one-stop shop. This is obviously predominantly for services which are not in the EU. So the existing one-stop shop scheme was limited for a range of B2C services, and this was replaced. And any business that is not established in the EU, now including UK suppliers, will be able to charge EU VAT on services to consumers, and they can now account for that and pay that through the non-union one-stop shop. The scope of this scheme has been significantly extended from the previously MOSS scheme, which only requires non-EU business to report VAT on telecommunications, broadcasting, electronic services supplied to EU customers. So again, you've got quarterly reporting here. One registration will cover all EU member states. Next slide, please. So how does the one-stop shop work? So it's important that we just look at that. Really, in essence, it is very similar to the import one-stop shop. They are aligned in many ways. VAT collection at checkout, apply the right VAT, inform customers you are OSS compliant. Next. You would then have validating your monthly sales, identifying that VAT that needs to be paid, but through the one-stop shop portal here. Next. Can use an intermediary services to validate your figures, the VAT that you need to account for, what countries, and again, acting as your representative with local tax authorities there. Next. You would access, instead of the import one-stop shop, you would access the OSS portal and submit quarterly returns. So again, main difference here is not monthly returns, but it's moving to a quarterly basis. And again, your representative intermediaries can be used to complete this reporting for you. Next slide, please. So again, we put this slide together. So when each VAT scheme should be used. So trying to identify with traders, businesses, which one would be relevant. So if you are moving B2C goods, then you should be, and they're under 150 euros, you don't hold an EU VAT registration, then you should be looking at the import one-stop shop. If you have goods which you're established in the EU, you're looking at distance selling within the EU or domestic supply, then you should be looking at the one-stop shop. But these are goods which are already in the European Union. If you obviously are a non-EU taxable person, supplier, providing services to the EU, then you would be looking at that non-union one-stop shop registration. So again, truly to identify the decision points that you should be making in regard to what VAT schemes are operational for you. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll hand over to Will for our second poll of today. So over to you, Will.
Thank you, Paul. That last slide in particular was really useful. Maybe we might come back to that in a second because we had a few questions asking around that, basically around that slide. But I'll launch this next poll now, just basically to ask, have you registered to IOSS or OSS? Options there being yes to both, yes to OSS, yes to just IOSS, or neither.
Okay.
So while people are answering that poll, Paul, first question I'm going to ask is from Brenda, and you touched on it. But I guess clear answer would be really good. How does this affect traders in Northern Ireland?
Okay, so affecting traders in Northern Ireland. So yes, so in Northern Ireland, you would be looking at the EU long distance selling thresholds, yeah, because they're part of the single market. You can utilise that there, most definitely. Potentially, you can have an Oss registration there because you're supplying goods within intra-community supplies, much like we were before, obviously, the UK GB left the EU. So again, you are open to the single market registrations for that process. Remember that when you're looking at Northern Ireland, if you are going to be supplying goods from Northern Ireland into Europe, you wouldn't really need the IOSS, would you? Because goods are already in within the single market. You'd be using your Oss regulation, not the non-union one, the intra-community one, to facilitate your movements within that single market.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to share the results of this poll because it's really interesting.
Okay, great.
So 87% of our respondents haven't
Oh,
registered to either yet. Yes,
yeah,
3% to both, 3% to OSS, 7% to IOSS. So this really
wow.
does reiterate the importance of this webinar, doesn't it?
It does, and you know, I suppose with all the regulatory changes we've had, kind of the choppy waters we've got out there with different rules coming into place, we've got new packaging, plastic packaging regulations coming in, all the other changes, the pandemic hopefully going away now, and especially that being so complex, it's not surprising that some traders haven't registered for either because they're unsure how to do that, and there is additional costs which come with having a fiscal representative, you know, and it's actually not a shock that I would see that with a lot of these portals and VAT compliance, people aren't wanting to make mistakes in regard to VAT. It's a big thing. We've had it recently, haven't we, Will, in the article in regard to China imports coming into Great Britain, and the EU has actually charged them with you know, missing VAT, which, you know, is from a government perspective. But again, it shows you the importance. If countries can be at fault, then so can traders. So again, it's more to understand from this webinar today what they mean, which one should I use, how do I use it, what's best process, and I think that's really what we're looking at there.
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and thanks everyone for answering so honestly as well. That's really interesting for us to know. But if I hide the poll, Matt, I wonder if you can move back to the previous slide because we've got a few questions just around
Sure.
kind of which scheme is used and where. So it could be a recap of a slide, but it's definitely asked, is IOSS for online sales? Emmanuel asks, what if we export to Europe B2B or less than 150 euros? And we had a question from Emmanuel, does IOSS or OSS apply to B2B exports of less than 150 euros? So I guess could you just run through the slide again, because I think that might help with a few of the different questions we're getting.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I mean, I'll take those as well. So predominantly, these VAT schemes are there for B2C transactions. That's what we need to understand. So the OSS could be that you have products in Europe, like Northern Ireland, that you're supplying to an individual as a service or as goods into the EU. They are predominantly B2C. If you're looking at business to business transactions, you would be looking at your Incoterms there, not DDP, maybe DAP is the company which is registered into in the EU. They would be responsible for import formalities, accounting for import VAT, and then processing that as part of their VAT return because they are EU registered. You know, so they're really important aspects to understand. E-commerce is predominantly around B2C operations. Yeah, so again, Incoterms is really critical if you're looking at your B2B supply. I would also recommend looking at the rules of supply as well there, because based on services or goods and where you are selling them to and what the point of sale is, there is different VAT obligations there. But do remember, if you are looking to sell B2B, then you can use reverse charge mechanism VAT, where you push that VAT obligation onto the person receiving the goods, so they would have to account for it. Does that help, Will?
Yeah, I think so. And sorry, Matt, could you just bring back that previous slide again? Because that was
No
the
worries.
one which I think people will find useful. Just one last
Yep.
question from Richard before we move on again. Does the 150 euro figure include or exclude the freight price?
It's a really good question. It's a consignment of the value, so it excludes the freight cost. That is obviously what people have added into their basket. Some B2C traders will do free of charge in regard to shipping costs and delivery. It's not your calculation for customs or VAT, it's what they are selling online for that product. Yeah, so obviously you'll be looking at that plus the VAT. So again, it's the value they would pay, and then VAT is on top of that, but you do have to stay under that threshold. If not, if you're over it, it's a classic case of having to register in every EU country and being able to account for VAT in each of those countries if you're over those thresholds. And the value is quite low. There are ongoing discussions at the moment about updates they may be doing to the one-stop shop. We have no clarity from the EU Commission yet, but again, that will take part of future webinars that we do once we have more clarity and we have a timeline for those. There's been a lot of concerns over the value limit, because based on products you offer on a website, people could click on 3 or 4 things and then all of a sudden you're at €300. Oh dear, how am I going to account for VAT? I need to do that, because when we look at B2C, we see delivered duty paid. I expect to pay for an order and it just arrives on Wednesday. We don't expect to say, oh, pay import duty, pay customs duty. Yeah, these are things which a consumer is not experiencing. And if that happens, they could potentially just go to other competitors out there. They may switch to EU. Yes, EU regulations are saying an even playing field. Some people could differ on that, because yeah, it's an even playing field for the EU and gives them more advantage, but for traders which are outside the EU, it does put these extra burden, and low thresholds really push that to the European domestic marketplace.
Thanks, Paul. So just to let everyone know, I mean, with the webinar's billed as being a 45-minute one, I think we're going to have to run to the full hour. But this is being recorded. You will get a copy of the slides. So for anyone who has to leave at 45 past, you will get that information. But yeah, time's of the essence. So back to you, Paul.
Yeah, no problem at all. Thank you as well. The questions are really great, because this is what these webinars are about. If you've got concerns, questions, we try to answer them as best as we can. So when we're looking at this, if we're looking at how to register, the first thing for the import one-stop shop you would be looking at is how to appoint an intermediary. We have had pre-defined questions which have come through. Obviously, as a charity, we don't, and there's no governments which actually say this is a list of intermediaries to use or representatives, but a simple Google search will bring out there is a host of them out there with global expertise which can help you with that. Again, there's going to be a cost for it. Best practice would be to look at 10 of them, speak to them, look at the costs, what services they could offer, understand what you want to do, what you want them to do, and then associate which is going to be best for your business moving forward. You also should register for IOSS Portal in the country that you are looking to register. So again, when we're looking at this, if say I was looking to supply my goods into Germany, I'll be looking at the German website and applying to the IOSS portal in that country. There isn't a generic European portal that you would go to register. It's done at the country. A lot of people look at Republic of Ireland primarily because it's in English, it's the same language, it's pretty clear. There's loads of good, useful information, guides and documents there to help you along the way of understanding and navigating it. So again, lots of people are looking for the Republic of Ireland to obviously register for that IOSS portal. After you've done that, you will be provided an IOSS registration number. You do have to ensure that this is present on shipping paperwork. So attach that to your boxes, you're shipping your commercial invoice folded inwards, have that IOSS number in there, because that's going to be really important when it arrives in the country, so they know that you are import VAT exempt, because you will pay for it on a monthly return. And also really important is also if you're in Great Britain, to tell HMRC you are registered under the IOSS. There is a link directly for that, which is really important. So again, looking at all of these aspects and refocusing on this, this IOSS number will be obtained when you register at the country which you choose to through their local tax office. This will be required for distance sellers and marketplaces in order to sell to buyers in the EU under the Import One-Stop Shop scheme. Although these numbers are ultimately designed to make EU import VAT charges and payments an easier process, there are several things to really consider. I would always be looking at the registration. IOSS is designed predominantly for e-commerce and online market sales. So you'll need to be able to assess what the ISS offers your business depending on your needs. What are your consignment average values? Will you be over the threshold anyway? So what's the point of applying for it? Location. If you're outside of the EU, you do not have an established presence within any EU country, you must register with an IOSS intermediary, a representative that is needed as part of the scheme. If you don't have a representative, when it comes to registering, you won't be able to complete your application. They will need to be in place prior to applying. And again, these are then appointed, and this will help you make your payments either by those representatives, or it could actually be yourself logging onto the portal and dealing with it yourself. You may have a VAT team in-house which can deal with this compliance. Do be aware of VAT variations. If you sell to EU customers in countries, you may need to consider varying tax rates for those locations. So again, and this sometimes you need to provide in advance to marketplaces such as Amazon, Etsy, yeah, and they will put that ownership on you as the seller of the goods. So although the new IOSS scheme will see the creation of this new numbering format, it will be very similar to the format currently used for VAT numbers. Currently, a VAT number is around 9 characters long with a mixture of letters and numbers, which indicates various unique features. You have the next slide, please. In regard to the OSS, we've put the hyperlink in the material today, which you will get a copy of. There is the OSS portal, which means that you can register directly there. You don't have to go to a specific government's taxation system to be able to do it, like the IOSS. You would select if you want to use union or non-union status. Remember the two differences that we mentioned earlier. If union, you would state the member state of identification, and the OSS registration number will then be provided to you. Yeah, so again, each member state will evaluate the conditions to be met and will approve your OSS registration submitted in its jurisdiction. So again, really important to be aware of any conditions that might need to be met there. Next slide, please. So now we're going to look at how we really use a portal. So we'll have the next slide, please, Matt. So how to use a portal. So once you are registered on the relevant EU portal, you can have the following two profiles. You can be an online seller, or you can have an electronic interface. Now these are really two key things here. So you can get a registration. Yeah, you can go to the portal once a month, submit your return for B2C shipments you've done for every country as an overview, submit it and pay your VAT. That's one option. Other options which we are seeing out there at the moment are electronic interfaces. So again, this will be third parties, which you'll send their information to them. They will validate it and they will electronically submit that to the portal and account for your VAT. So again, a bit like if you're using a third party for customs declarations, a freight forwarder, they have that interface with HMRC. There's other VAT providers out there which have that interface with the VAT portals as well, which make it a more simplified approach for yourself. Remember, you do have the option to use a third party to take on that deemed seller responsibilities. Again, there might be a financial guarantee needed there. And do remember that if you make any errors in filing on the Import One-Stop Shop or the OSS, that will be down to the registration owner to fix that error. Okay, so do be aware of when you've got errors in filing. If it was a third party, taxman's still going to knock on your door to get that rectified. So again, there is a shared responsibility there, but the onus is to get it right first time around. Next slide, please. So what's a physical process for the IOSS? So it's great that we've got the scheme. We know the values, we know the limits, we know what we need to do, we know how to register, but what's that physical process? What's that customer journey like? So at the time of import, customs will validate the IOSS VAT identification number included, and that is in the customs declaration. So again, what they're doing is the customs authority are going to look up a centralized database of IOSS registration. So when you're registered, you go onto this database. So they'll check that you are registered. If you're not, they're going to charge you import VAT at import. So again, really important this is included. We don't recommend you publishing this out to everyone, but if you're using a freight forward, a certain operator, then obviously definitely make sure that they hold that on file so they know you are IOSS registered. Again, have it on the commercial paperwork, which will be attached to the shipment. If you're using Royal Mail, we've had a question about that today, then Royal Mail itself has information. If you look at Royal Mail and the import one-stop shop online, it will take you to their service. There is a specific field you need to complete when you're creating your shipment, which will identify that it's IOSS. Again, if it's traveling by a local country postal service when it arrives, let's say in Spain, then you want to have that commercial invoice attached as a pouch to the side of it so they understand that it is VAT exempt and that registration number is known. If the number is confirmed as valid, the goods again will be exempt from import VAT and paid via your monthly return. If the number's not valid, you'll get charged at import. Pretty straightforward. There is no obligation to validate that number by any freight forwarder. This will be done by customs when it arrives in that country. So again, some critical steps there that you do need to take. Next slide, please. So when you look at the monthly import one-stop shop return, a business intermediary representative can do these. So again, if you're unaware, you're a bit concerned about doing this with your VAT obligations, this is why there's service providers out there which can offer you that expertise. The IOSS VAT return must be made whether or not any supplies have been made. So yes, February is a great month. March, actually we haven't sold anything through the IOSS. You still need to report a nil return. Yeah, just because you haven't sold anything doesn't mean you don't have to do the return. And this will include the total value of goods sold, what their VAT rate is, and the amount of VAT to be paid broken down by the member state that you've shipped them to. Yeah, so again, that submission will be done, one payment through the portal of the import VAT, and then your VAT requirements have been taken care of for the month. Next slide, please. If we're looking at corrections on any IOSS VAT returns, where a correction to this is required, it must be submitted on the following month. You can't amend ones which have gone in for February. So if it's March returns you're looking for, then you have to have that correction. They must be included within 3 years of the filing date of the original return. So there is some leeway there. It doesn't have to mandatorily be the next month. It can only be made by completing the correction panel in the subsequent return, which is on the portal. And any return should identify the member state where it's consumed, the amount of VAT corrected, and the tax period that it related to, because then that can be clearly understood. Next slide, please. So, Will, over to you for the next poll, please.
Thanks, Paul. We're just going to ask about your awareness in terms of how to comply with these new rules. Once again, we'll take this opportunity to ask some questions, but we are running short time. So we've received over 100 questions during and before the webinar. So we won't be able to get to all of your questions, everyone. Thank you for writing them in. But what we can say is that we are continuing to provide webinars on this topic. We've got a lunchtime learning for our members in a couple of weeks about this. We do training on this, we do consultancy, and this is probably going to be a topic we come back to in this program, this free program later on in the year as well.
Sure. Yeah.
Paul, just while people are answering, Catherine has asked to apply for local VAT, we need a representative. How do we find one? And once they help us to file the VAT, do we still need them for compliance?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. We mentioned this earlier. So you should always check the EU country that you want to set up operations. Not all EU member states need a representative, but for these VAT simplification schemes that were mentioned today, you do need one. Yeah, so again, two elements there to be aware of. There are no government lists, but service providers can be found, like I said, on that simple Google search. I mentioned finding about 10 to 15 review them. You can, once you've got them, representative, you can actually do your own VAT submissions through the portal, yeah, and manage the compliance yourself, or you can get those to do those submissions for you, maintain that compliance, validate your figures to make sure that there is no deviations there. So again, no real list, but yeah, if you just look on IOSS on any internet search, the raft of suppliers which are out there is quite astounding at the moment and shows how important it is.
And one from Poonam, which I think a few people have been asking in different ways.
Okay.
Do you have to appoint different representatives for different EU countries, or is it just one and you're in?
One and then you're in. Okay. Usually there will be some representatives which are specific, like to Spain or Germany. But you know, if you look at some of the global VAT providers out there which offer representatives, then obviously they are valid in all EU countries. So it is really worth checking of where they have their presence. Are they specific for one country, or can they offer every EU member state? Do remember, if you are using Royal Mail, they do have two service providers on there, which I'm not going to plug today, but you can just go to the Royal Mail website for that, which do offer those services for you. For me, they seem a bit expensive, but if you're using Royal Mail, they have those integrated options because of the IOSS and the requirements which are needed.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks everyone for answering the poll. So the majority of you are either fully aware or moderately
Yes,
aware,
good.
and so that's promising. But Paul, the time is of the essence. So if you could whittle through these slides, bearing in mind people will get a copy of them afterwards in the
Yeah,
first
sure.
5 minutes, and then we'll try to do a couple more questions.
Yeah, no problem at all. Yeah, so let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so now it's really about just maintaining compliance. A couple of slides just to overview that. So let's have the next one, please, Matt. Okay, so with IOSS compliance, you display the amount of VAT to be paid by the buyer in the EU. There would have to be in the EU currency as well. Do be aware of that. You should state their final destination. Ensure that you're not over the threshold. Show the invoice, the price paid by the buyer in euros, as I've mentioned. Submit these monthly returns. Key thing here, you've got to keep your records for 10 years. Usually VAT compliance, we're expecting 6 years. It's 10 years with the IOSS. So again, record keeping of a key there. And you should include your IOSS VAT identification number to the person declaring the goods at the border. That's why we say commercial invoice, getting that VAT exemption there. Next slide, please. OSS compliance, obviously ensure you don't breach place a supply EU threshold, which is 10,000 euros. If you do, then you do need to register in that country. Quarterly VAT returns, so not monthly, but quarterly here. You should report all distance selling transactions. A payment deadline is 30 days after the expiry of that reporting period. And there's some really great guidance of how to complete OSS VAT returns on HMRC, taking you through those guides, what you need to include, what you don't. And we've put the link on the material there for you. Next slide, please. So key questions I would say with VAT compliance is, are your sales eligible for registration with the OSS or IOSS? So have a look at that. Which scheme am I part of? Is it required for me? Do you need an intermediary? If you're a UK seller, you may need one. Do you have the right software to collect, track and remit the VAT? Yeah, so again, you know, from sales, are you pulling the right information out there that gives you the ability to report what you need to do? Do I need to help to get it right? There is specialist e-commerce accountants which can advise you on the routes to take, and also representatives which can work on your behalf and be that representative with the local tax authority. So again, do bear those in mind. Next slide, please. And recent changes. So again, we've mentioned that there is onward going discussions about the IOSS. We'll give you more when we know more. At the moment, it's just under discussion points. But many EU countries have put in new reporting obligations, or they're planning to do so in the future. So it is worth bearing in mind of the updates that you get through the Institute of Export and International Trade. These talk about pre-filled VAT returns, so that's soon a reality in Italy. France and Poland are considering mandatory e-invoicing rather than physical. Poland's recently implemented a split payment and a whitelist of VAT payers. So if you're on the whitelist there, and a separate VAT return will cease to exist in Poland within the next month. So again, there's some real changes and evolvement from the e-commerce directive and VAT in Europe, which actually is looking for the better as well. So next slide, please. So final questions, Will, over to your good self.
Thank you, Paul. Again, thank you everyone for all the questions. There's so many have come through, really interesting. So
Yeah.
I'll try to do a couple which summarize or group together a few questions we've received.
Fine.
One from Judy, picking up on the point you were just saying, actually, there's rules, different systems in different countries in the EU. How can traders stay on top of all of this, all of the different rules?
Well, I suppose it's being aware of what obviously rules you're operating under. So look at the country, the member state, go to their tax authority website, making sure it's there. Obviously, there's consultancy out there, so people can help you with that. But also, if you are going with a fiscal representative, the service fee you're paying should be for updates and changes into that local member state as well. So they should be keeping you abreast of changes which are there. We all know the difficulties. If I'm going to the Italian taxation website, I don't know about everyone else, but my Italian isn't that great. It could be difficult to understand that. So there are lots of other parties out there. So if you looked at LinkedIn channels, which will give you updates of what's happening in different EU member states and globally. So again, really worth reaching out to those social media platforms. And of course, IOE will update as soon as we know anything that is posted out on our daily comms and our updates that we do, which Will's team deliver. So we do try to keep traders up to speed in regard to those VAT requirements, because they are changing quite a lot.
Thanks, Paul. And yeah, if you're not already, do sign up to our daily update, because that's where we put out that information. Just one last question is grouping together a few different strands. Nifin has asked about how IOSS works for low value imports from China, and how intermediary registration for UK is done and what the process will be. So I guess, yeah, that kind of non-EU markets, how is IOSS going to work for those countries?
Well, IOSS is all about bringing goods into the European Union. It's mandatory legislation. It doesn't matter if you're in China, Uzbekistan, or you're sending it over from Manchester. Yeah, there is a threshold. Yeah, if you are then got a representative and you have that number and you're bringing your goods in from Beijing, they're underneath that threshold. The same aspects will be required to yourselves as well. There is no low value consignment relief anymore. It's been removed. Yeah, everything's got import VAT. So if you're in America, China, wherever, you can still use a one-stop shop, because just like Great Britain, we are outside of the EU now, and this is about bringing goods into that country. Again, representatives are there. Online, you go and speak to people and you make sure that you can bring that in correctly and make sure that you're going with. So you've got people which are expertise in market, and they can also be the direct contact point with the tax authority as well, because that's really important when potential queries can come through.
Thank you, Paul. And if we move on to the last slide now, I'm afraid, everyone, we're going to have to wrap up. Paul, that was fantastic, and it's a huge topic, presentation and answers in the time we've had. I hope everyone has found that useful. But just to say on this last slide, if you do need more support or answers to your questions, quite a lot of company-specific questions coming in, which obviously we can't really do on this forum because we've got over 200 almost 300 people were on the line at points today, so we weren't able to go into company specifics because we want to keep it relevant to the broader audience. But if you do still have questions or need support on this issue, on these rules, do look at our training, our consultancy. We have another lunchtime learning webinar coming up. There's loads more information on export.org.uk. And indeed, it's not just VAT rules, it's helping companies deal with Brexit, the pandemic, tragically, the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We're looking at all the trade angles and how we can support traders with all of those issues. So please do look at the website for more information. Just a reminder, we will be, sorry, Paul.
Oh, well, sorry, just as a note, we're doing a lunchtime learning is next Thursday, and that is on e-commerce generally, not obviously it will include IOSS and OSS, but again, that will be next Thursday if anybody's interested.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, and again, that's on the website. So if you go into events and there's a drop down which says webinars, you'll see the link to it there. But just a reminder, we will be sending everyone a recording of today's webinar along with the slides. That'll come over the next day or so. Please do get in touch if for any reason that email doesn't come through to your inbox. Maybe it's gone to spam or something like that. That does happen. So do get in touch if you don't get that information in the next day or so. As you leave, please do let us know what you thought of today's webinar and any suggestions for topics on future webinars by completing the exit survey. But again, apologies if we didn't get to your question. As you say, it's a free webinar and it's trying to cater to a broad audience. So we hope everyone has found that useful. But for now, thank you everyone and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you everyone. Take care.